In Tokyo, the man chosen to design the first blow against America did not sound like a conqueror. He sounded like a man reading the date on his own defeat. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto had spent years inside the country Japan was preparing to attack. He had studied there. He had walked its streets. He had watched Americans argue, buy, sell, build, waste, invent, and organize. And because of that, he understood something many men around him refused to admit. America was not weak because it looked messy. It was dangerous because the mess could move. Yamamoto's warning was blunt. For 6 months, perhaps a year, he believed he could run wild across the Pacific. After that, he had no real expectation of success. He was not afraid of American honor. He was not afraid of American speeches. He was afraid of American factories. The men who overruled that fear saw a different nation. They saw a country of shopkeepers and bankers, a country softened by cars, radios, movie theaters, and political arguments, a country protected by oceans for so long that in their minds it had forgotten how to bleed. That belief became the foundation of one of the most expensive mistakes in military history. Japan did not just underestimate American battleships. It underestimated the kind of country America became when someone finally gave it one enemy, one deadline, and permission to stop arguing. Pearl Harbor was meant to smash a fleet. It did something far worse for Japan. It threw a switch. To see why Tokyo reached for that switch at all, you have to begin with the pressure already crushing Japan before a single bomb fell on Hawaii. By 1941, Japan's war in China was no longer the short, glorious campaign its leaders had imagined. It had become a draining, brutal, 4-year struggle swallowing men, steel, money, fuel, and political patience. The empire wanted to look unstoppable, but underneath the uniforms and flags it had a simple problem. Modern war ran on oil, and Japan did not have enough of it. More than 4/5 of Japan's imported oil came from the United States. That meant the proud Imperial Japanese Navy, the symbol of national destiny, depended on a country its leaders increasingly treated as an obstacle. Washington knew it. So, step by step, President Franklin Roosevelt's administration tightened the pressure. Scrap iron and steel were restricted. Aviation fuel was restricted. Japanese assets in the United States were frozen. To American officials, these measures were a way to force Japan back from expansion. To the militarists in Tokyo, they were an insult dressed as diplomacy. Then, on August 1st, 1941, after Japanese forces moved deeper into French Indochina, the United States cut off oil and gasoline. That was the moment the argument changed. This was not another warning. This was the hand closing around Japan's throat. Inside the Japanese Navy, fuel was no longer an abstract resource. It became a calendar. The fleet had roughly 18 months of strategic reserves. Every training run, every patrol, every engine test burned hours that could not be replaced. The Empire had built a navy powerful enough to dominate the Western Pacific. Now that navy was slowly being trapped by its own fuel tanks. The choice before Japan's leaders looked to them, like humiliation or risk. One path meant withdrawing from China, accepting American pressure, and admitting that the dream of a self-sufficient empire had failed. The other path meant taking the resources by force. The southern advance promised oil in the Dutch East Indies, rubber in Malaya, tin bases, and a resource wall across Southeast Asia. It promised a way to keep fighting in China and escape the American leash. But the map had one problem that could not be ignored. The American-held Philippines sat on Japan's flank, and the Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor sat behind it like a loaded weapon. Japan did not need to conquer the United States. It needed to stun the United States. The plan was to knock the Pacific Fleet off balance, seize the southern resources, build an island fortress line, and make the cost of fighting back look unbearable. It was not a plan based only on ships and aircraft. It was a plan based on a psychological guess. Tokyo believed a single devastating strike would prove to Americans that the Pacific was not worth the price. It believed the shock would deepen division, weaken Roosevelt, and pull Washington toward negotiation. The attack itself looked, at first, like proof. Before 8 in the morning on December 7, 1941, Japanese aircraft came down over Pearl Harbor. Torpedoes ran through the water. Bombs struck ships at anchor. Smoke rose over Battleship Row. Airfields burned. Men who had been eating breakfast minutes earlier were suddenly fighting for their lives. The reports returning to Japan were almost intoxicating. Battleships had been sunk or crippled. American aircraft were destroyed on the ground. The Pacific Fleet seemed wounded in its own home. This was the exact moment Japan's theory was supposed to become reality. The government in Washington was supposed to stagger. The American public was supposed to panic. The long argument between isolationists and interventionists was supposed to split the country open. Instead, it closed, not gently, like a steel door. The attack did not make Americans calculate. It made them furious. Years of public argument collapsed into one fact. America had been attacked. The debate that had trapped Roosevelt for so long simply burned away. The next day, Congress heard him speak of December 7th as a date that would live in infamy. He did not sound like a man looking for a compromise. He sounded like a president standing in front of a nation that had already decided. Only one vote in Congress stood against declaring war on Japan. That was the first failure of the Japanese plan. The blow designed to weaken American will had created a mandate for total war. But the deeper failure was still hidden, because the real danger was not just that America was angry. The real danger was that anger in America had machinery behind it. Japan's leaders understood discipline. They understood sacrifice. They understood state power and military hierarchy. What they did not understand was how quickly a capitalist consumer economy could be converted when the market, the government, and public fury all pointed in the same direction. They had looked at Detroit and seen comfort. Cars, traffic, salesmen, luxury. They had not seen a dormant weapons system. At Willow Run in Michigan, Ford was asked to build the B-24 Liberator, a heavy bomber so complex that many assumed mass production would be impossible. Ford's answer was not to build a normal factory. It built an industrial city. A mile-long assembly line began turning aircraft construction into a rhythm. When reports of the output reached Japanese intelligence, some dismissed them as exaggeration. Heavy bombers could not be built like automobiles. Not real bombers. Not complicated four-engine machines full of wiring, hydraulics, guns, and crews. But Willow Run made the impossible ordinary. At its peak, a new B-24 rolled off the line in about 63 minutes. Japan could build superb machines. America could build replacements faster than Japan could destroy them. And the same logic spread to the sea. On the West Coast, Henry Kaiser's shipyards attacked shipbuilding like a production problem. Instead of slow craft methods, they used prefabricated sections, welding, scheduling pressure, and relentless competition. A large cargo ship had once been the work of many months. Now Liberty ships were launched at a pace that made old naval assumptions look childish. In November 1942, the SS Robert E. Peary went from Kiel, laying to launch in 4 days, 15 hours, and 29 minutes. To a warrior elite raised on the language of spirit and handcrafted excellence, this could look crude, soulless, industrial, unromantic. But war does not ask whether a ship has a soul. It asks whether the ammunition arrives. It asks whether the spare parts arrive. It asks whether the next bomber is already rolling forward before the last one has even disappeared into the clouds. Japan had counted American materialism as a weakness. It turned out to be a delivery system, and it was not only men who entered that system. This was another blind spot Tokyo never properly measured. Japanese propaganda had often pictured American women as soft, stylish, unserious, and absorbed in modern comfort. In Japan's own social order, the idea that women could become a vast industrial reserve was difficult for many leaders to imagine. Then millions of American men entered uniform, and millions of American women entered the war plants. The poster said, "We can do it." The factories proved it. Women welded hulls, riveted aircraft, inspected ammunition, operated cranes, read gauges, ran machine tools, and stepped into jobs that had been described as impossible for them until the national emergency made that description useless. This mattered for more than labor numbers. It revealed something Japan had missed about American society. The country was flexible, messy, yes, argumentative, yes. But once mobilized, it could move people across roles faster than a rigid society believed possible. Japan expected to fight a nation of consumers. Instead, it found itself fighting a nation that could turn consumers into producers almost overnight. And still, the American answer was not only material, it was psychological. Tokyo had believed Americans would not endure a long, bloody war across an ocean. The Pacific was too far away. The sacrifices would be too heavy. Public opinion would sour. That was the calculation. Then, on April 18, 1942, 16 B-25 bombers lifted off from the deck of the USS Hornet. They were too large for the job in any comfortable sense. Their takeoff was a gamble. Their mission, led by Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle, was not designed to cripple Japan's industry. It could not. The damage was small, but the message was enormous. American bombers had appeared over Tokyo, over the heart of the empire, near the Imperial Palace. The raid told Japan something no communique could soften. The war would come home. In Tokyo, the shock was deeper than the physical damage. The military had promised that the homeland was protected by distance, by perimeter, by the sacred aura around the empire itself. The Doolittle raid punctured that promise, and that emotional wound pushed Japanese strategy toward another gamble. Yamamoto wanted the American carriers destroyed. He wanted to extend the defensive perimeter far enough that no raid like this could happen again. That obsession helped create the operation against Midway. So the raid that Japan dismissed militarily became powerful strategically. It did not break Japan's factories. It pushed Japan's fleet toward a battle where the Americans were already learning how to listen. Because while shipyards and aircraft plants were changing the material balance, quiet rooms were changing the information balance. In a basement at Pearl Harbor, Commander Joseph Rochefort and his codebreakers worked through fragments of Japan's naval communications. The system was difficult, incomplete, and frustrating. But piece by piece, the Americans began to read enough of the Japanese naval code to see the shape of Yamamoto's plan, target, timing, forces, direction. Midway was not guessed in the dark, it was anticipated. That was the part Japan had failed to understand about adaptation. America did not need to begin the war perfect. It needed to survive long enough to learn. In the air, the same lesson was taking shape. At the start of the war, the Japanese Zero was a terrifying aircraft. It could turn tighter than American fighters. Its veteran pilots had combat experience earned over years in China. Early American pilots who tried to fight it on its terms often paid for that mistake. But the Americans studied the mistake. Commander John Thack developed a weaving tactic that let two fighters protect one another and draw an attacking Zero into a crossing shot. The maneuver did not make the Zero weak. It made its strongest advantage less decisive. That was a different kind of power. Not spirit against steel, learning against assumption. Japan's pilot corps was elite, but it was also fragile. Its best aviators had taken years to create. They could not be replaced quickly. America built a pipeline. Training bases spread across the country. Young men who had never seen a carrier deck were pushed through a system that turned civilians into naval aviators at industrial scale. They were not all aces. They did not have to be. They were good enough, numerous enough, and backed by better machines arriving in greater numbers every month. By 1944, the original Japanese vision of the war was collapsing under the weight of its own timeline. The short war had not stayed short. The resource empire had not made Japan invulnerable. The American public had not demanded peace. The factories had not slowed. The pilots had not run out. The codebreakers had not gone silent. The switch Japan threw in 1941 was still feeding power into the machine, and on June 19, 1944, in the Philippine Sea, that machine finally answered in full. Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa sent the last great carrier force of the Imperial Japanese Navy toward battle. On paper, it was still a fleet. It had decks, aircraft, officers, flags, and orders. But the appearance of strength hid the truth. The veteran pilots of 1941 were largely gone. The replacements had been rushed through a shrinking system. Many were brave, many were loyal. But they were being sent into the sky against an enemy that now had radar, fighter direction, hardened tactics, superior aircraft, and pilots trained by a country that could produce almost everything faster than Japan could replace it. Opposing them was Task Force 58, not merely a group of ships, a floating industrial system. Radar screens watched the sky far beyond human eyesight. Fighter directors turned information into intercept courses. Grumman F-6F Hellcats waited on carrier decks, built to do what early war fighters could not: meet the Zero and kill it. When the Japanese attack waves came in, they did not surprise the Americans. They appeared first as distant blips, then as coordinates, then as targets. American fighters were vectored outward before the Japanese pilots could even see the fleet they had been sent to strike. The result was so lopsided that one American aviator compared it to an old-time turkey shoot. By sunset, hundreds of Japanese aircraft were gone. More than 350 were destroyed across the battle, while American air combat losses were a fraction of that. Two of Japan's largest carriers were lost as well. In one day, Japan's carrier air arm was not merely defeated, it was gutted, and the deeper meaning was brutal. This was not a lucky American afternoon. It was the delayed answer to the question Tokyo had asked at Pearl Harbor. Could a democratic, commercial, argumentative, comfort-loving nation absorb a blow and keep fighting? The answer was now flying through the Philippine Sea in radar-directed formations. It was welded into Liberty ships. It was riveted into B-24 wings. It was stamped into fuel drums, radio parts, carrier decks, replacement engines, and training schedules. It was carried by women at machine tools and men on assembly lines. It was carried by codebreakers in hot rooms and pilots learning new tactics after old ones failed. Japan had imagined American disorder as weakness, but American disorder was not emptiness. It was capacity waiting for alignment. Before Pearl Harbor, Roosevelt had faced a country divided over whether foreign wars were worth American lives. The America First movement was not a fringe whisper. It was a serious political force. Millions of Americans wanted distance, caution, and neutrality. Roosevelt could aid Britain, he could warn, he could prepare around the edges, but he could not fully mobilize the nation for the war he believed was coming. Japan solved that problem for him. The attack did not simply damage ships. It eliminated the political space between peace and war. It made hesitation look impossible. It gave the American state what it had lacked, a national permission slip for total mobilization. That is why the Japanese miscalculation was so catastrophic. They did not misunderstand one weapon. They misunderstood an entire civilization under pressure. They believed a nation built around business would not fight a proper war. In one sense, they were right. America did not fight the war in the way Japan expected. It reorganized the war into production targets, shipping schedules, design improvements, training pipelines, code rooms, procurement contracts, and assembly lines. It turned war into a logistical enterprise so large that courage alone could not answer it. The Japanese warrior code had placed spiritual force above material abundance. But in the Pacific, Japan faced a different kind of spirit. The spirit of the engineer who fixes the defect, the shipyard worker who cuts the launch time, the woman who learns to weld before sunrise, the pilot instructor who turns fear into procedure, the codebreaker who makes one more fragment fit, the factory manager who looks at a bomber and asks how to build the next one faster. That was the hidden American weapon. Not softness, not decadence, not comfort, conversion. The ability to turn argument into mandate, consumers into workers, factories into arsenals, failures into doctrine, and distance into supply lines. Yamamoto had sensed it before the first aircraft ever lifted from a Japanese carrier deck. He knew Japan could win months. He doubted it could win years. And once America had been attacked, years became the only kind of war America was willing to fight. Japan meant to break the machine before it could move. Instead, Pearl Harbor turned the machine on.